Idaho Matters is brought to you in part by St. Luke's Pharmacy, now offering free home delivery. For daily medications or one time prescriptions, home delivery is easy to set up. It's convenient and safe. St. Luke's Pharmacy, now delivering to your doorstep. Information on how to get started at stlukesonline.org.
So you can't see this, but hopefully you can hear it. Behind every Boise State Public Radio podcast is a team working hard to bring you stories that matter. So if you value podcasts like this one, please support them. Hit donate at boisestatepublicradio.org. Thanks.
More Idaho Matters now from the studios of Boise State Public Radio News. I'm Gemma Gaudette. What does it look like after finding out your husband is a murderer? Well, that's something that the three women at the center of Elizabeth Arnott's latest novel are still trying to figure out. And that's not the only thing. Set in 1960s California, The Secret Lives of Murderers' Wives follows Beverly, Essie, and Margot as they each try to piece their lives back together. However, after a new series of killings begin in their community, the women, well, they decide to take matters into their own hands. So joining us now to talk more about this latest novel is the author herself. Elizabeth, welcome to the show. Really nice to have you with us.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
So, as I mentioned, your novel centers on the wives of these convicted killers. What inspired you to tell the story from their perspective rather than the perpetrator?
Well, I've always been fascinated by true crime, like so many of us are. I listen to the podcasts, watch the documentaries, read the books. But more recently, I'd found myself drawn to stories of those who are sort of adjacent to killers, adjacent to murderers, the wives, the sisters, the daughters, the family members, those who are almost left to pick through the rubble and deal with the fallout of the actions of these violent men. I started looking more into their stories and this perspective on crime. And as I was doing so, I got really angry actually, because it made me realize that these women are so very often sidelined. They're left as footnotes to these men's stories, and they are just sort of left behind to get on with their lives, try and live a meaningful life while dealing with the worst thing that somebody else has ever done. And so I thought, can I take some of these women? Can I fictionalize these women? Can I put them into a story, and can I give them power and agency? And can I let them have some fun? So that was the starting point of it, really. I wanted this sort of flipped perspective on the true crime story and to hear from the sort of forgotten victims of these crimes that we never hear from.
Mm. Were there any real life true crime stories or cases that inspired you while you were writing? I mean, I know you said you're a big fan of actual true crime, listening to the podcast, reading the books, but was there one in particular that maybe stood out to you as an inspiration?
There are and were married serial killers, and there are serial killers' wives who have gone on record to talk about what that experience was like, what it was like to live in a house with this sort of man. Dennis Rader, who called himself BTK, he's a very famous example of a married serial killer. He was married for about 30 years, I think, before his crimes even came to light. His wife has chosen to sort of move out of the spotlight, but his daughter, Kerry, has appeared in documentaries. She's written her own book, and she's spoken very openly about what it was like to live with him as a father, but also what it's been like to deal with the scrutiny and the fallout and the sort of judgment from the general public. And there are other serial killers' wives who've written books. The wife of the Green River Killer, she's written a book. And I didn't want to take sort of any one person's story as a whole and use that for my novel. I wanted to read as much as I could about these differing experiences and sort of choose little details to weave through my novel, a sort of a nod of respect to the women who lived through this thing. But it's remarkable the amount of shame and stigma, the amount of judgment that these women have to deal with when really they're just trying to move on with their lives and, as I said, build something meaningful from something terrible that's happened.
Was there anything that surprised you during your research about the lives of people who were connected to notorious crimes?
I think what surprised me was probably my own judgment that I had. I
Mm.
think it's very easy for us to look at these women and think, how could they not have known what was going on? I'd have known what was going on. I'd know if my husband was doing these things. But having done the research, having spent a lot of time with these stories and with my own characters, and speaking to experts about serial killers and what it's actually like to be the spouse of a serial killer, I now know that that is absolutely not the truth. 99.9% of the time, we cannot know what these people are doing. And I think that's something, that's the sort of empathy that we should extend to these women. I was surprised at my own sort of bias going into it and my own assumption that surely there was a small part of them that would have known what was going on. But I think that's absolutely a question that we need to sort of remove and stop thinking. Even now there was just recently a serial killer in the news, Rex Heuermann, who is the Long Island serial killer. He has just been in court in the past few weeks. And even now, his wife was outside court and she asked reporters to focus on the victim, his victims, to give them the
Hmm.
respect that they deserve. But still, she was asked, "How did you not know what was going on?"
Mm. So I want to talk more about the book itself now. As I mentioned, it's set in 1960s California. So was there something that drew you to that time period, to that place? And then how does that help shape the story you were telling?
Well, there are multiple reasons. The 60s is a very aesthetic, glamorous,
Hmm.
exciting, and interesting place to write about. I was spending over a year writing this book. And for me, it was so nice to be able to immerse myself in that amazing 60s period detail, the coal line dyes, the classic cars, the music, the films, the fashion. But not only that, the 1960s going into the early 70s was a real sort of boom time for serial killers. They weren't called serial killers at that point. The FBI's behavioral analysis unit hadn't been set up, and they were the ones that really brought that term into common parlance. But the idea of the mass murderer or the multiple murderer was starting to seep into people's consciousnesses, and we started to see them on the front of newspapers and things like that. So I wanted to tap into that sort of emergence of serial killers. But also, I wanted this to be a book that shines a light on the experience of being a woman. And the
Mm.
60s was still a difficult time to be a woman. In many states of America, women weren't allowed to serve on juries in the 1960s because it was felt that they were too emotional and they couldn't be rational and objective
Hmm.
enough to to fulfill that function, and being on a jury would take them away from the heart of the home and the kitchen, which is where they were supposed to be. You couldn't get a credit card, unless you were married, and even then your husband had to sign off on it. So I wanted to explore the experience of what it was like to be a woman at that time, at a time where there was a lot of serial killer activity. It's just sort of just all came together as this perfect melting pot of exciting things going on in the news and in culture. Obviously, in the background, we had things like space exploration, the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War. It was such a rich period of history to write in. And obviously, all the amazing 60s fashion and things like that just made it fun to write.
So what was interesting to me is that the three main characters, Beverly, Elsie, and Margot, they all coped very differently when it came to their husbands and their husbands' crimes. So, with three different characters, how did you go about developing each of their very distinct personalities, but also these emotional journeys that they went on?
You're absolutely right. They are very different women. And that's what I think is so lovely about their friendship. They have been drawn together by this terrible shared circumstance, but through their friendship, they've really thrived. Yet they are very different. The women came to me really organically at first. It was almost as if they showed up behind my laptop ready to take me through the story, which is a very
Mm.
bizarre writing experience to have. And I don't think it's one I'll have again. But as I delved into it a bit more, it became clear that they were each sort of different representation of the way in which you or I might respond to the news that our husband was a serial killer. So we have Beverly, who shoulders a lot of blame and guilt. She feels really responsible for the actions of her husband. She's a young mother. She really fears for her children and the impact of, everything on them. And she worries that her
Hmm.
son might have inherited the same sort of rotten core as his father. Then we have Elsie, who works in the newsroom. She's a lowly assistant to an editor, but she longs to be a reporter. And she's responded to the sort of powerlessness that she felt when she found out about her husband's crimes with a real thirst for knowledge and drive. She's a dog with a bone, Elsie. She's very intelligent, very determined, and she wants facts. And then we have Margot, who is sort of part of Hollywood society. She's really glamorous, at least on the surface. She wants people to think that she has not been affected by what her husband has done. So she will throw on sequins and faux fur and go to a Hollywood studio party and make it look like everything's fine. But we learn as the novel progresses that deep down she really is, as damaged and as vulnerable as everyone else. And I wanted my women to be representative of the idea that there's no one way to be a victim. There is no one way to deal with trauma. And hopefully, I think they've just blended into this really nice mix of women that is representative of how, with friendship, we can get through anything.
How do you think about, or how did you think about the social barriers that these women faced during this time and the ways that those, constraints actually shaped their choices or even how they thought of themselves?
I think, as a result of the society that they are operating in, particularly, I think the way in which these women are treated by law enforcement, they are pretty much ignored by the police. Their fears that there is a serial killer working at large are sort of ignored. I think it's made them all the more determined. Um, but there is actually a sort of anonymous character that runs throughout this novel, and I don't think it's a spoiler to say that we learn quite early on that it is a woman who's being held captive by a
Hmm.
man, and through those chapters we really can explore what it's like to be a woman in the 60s. But I think what's striking about those chapters is that they could almost apply today. I
Hmm.
talk in those chapters
Hmm.
about women fearing for their safety just by leaving the house. I mean, even now I can
Hmm.
go on social media and see women talking about, you know, having to think about their journey from the car to their front door, having to think, do I have keys in my hand in case I need to protect myself. That is something that still is happening today. So yes, I wanted to explore the restrictions that these women were facing in the 60s, but I think actually these things are still really, really pertinent today.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, everything you just said, I think as women, we always think about those things, right? I mean, it is a part of who we are. It's almost embedded and baked in us as women. And what I found interesting as well is that the story seems to be asking readers to consider personal responsibility, or maybe I should say stigma, right? And how that falls on the families of criminals. What conversations are you hoping that sparks about that idea? Because I do think about this sometimes about we always of course talk about victims' families and the victims, and I think that's so incredibly important. But there are times where I see these cases and I think about, wow, what must the perpetrator's family be going through? And I'm not doing that to give them grace. It is just something that I think maybe a lot of us wonder about.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. And I think very often we can conflate proximity with culpability or knowledge of something. We think because these women were making these men dinner, sleeping next to them at night, they had to know what was going on. And I think we place a lot of weight and responsibility on female intuition But
Hmm.
actually, I don't think that's necessarily fair because if you speak to experts about serial killers, and I've interviewed forensic psychologists, people who've sort of sat opposite serial killers in prison. Many of them will say that very often serial killers are psychopaths or sociopaths, or they will have, certain personality traits that mean that they are masters at compartmentalization and manipulation. They live their lives as separate identities. You know, the Dennis Rader, the BTK, he
Hmm.
called it cubing. He called it turning out different facets of his personality in different social settings. He saw himself in the house as a great father, a great husband, and he saw himself in a completely different identity when he was out killing. And so I hope people will sort of start to think about the responsibility that we place on women to have this sort of sixth sense and to know what was going on when actually nobody is immune to being controlled or manipulated or lied to. And so I hope we will sort of extend some grace to, not only victims and their families, but the families of the perpetrators too.
I also think you've done such a good job about the core of this book, at least to me, really feels like a story about friendship. How did you think about these relationship, and not just who these women are, but who they allow themselves to become, and really also how these friendships sustain them.
What I really wanted this to be was an honest look at female friendship. And female friendship isn't always, you know, flowers and rainbows and everyone getting along. These women have been sort of thrust up against one another by because of a very difficult situation. But they are very honest with one another. These women argue, they bicker, they judge one another. It's a very honest portrayal of female friendship. But I do think what it does sort of go to show, what it does explore, is that as women, we, for centuries have relied on one another and one another's friendship for survival. And that really is the case with Beverly, Elsie, and Margot. They might not like each other a lot of the time, they might have furious rows, but they save one another time and time again. And that is really what I wanted the core message of this book to be. That friendship will out, friendship will get us through really difficult situations. And I would love people to read this book to, close the back cover and to think, right, I'm gonna call an old friend and have a good catch up with
Mm.
them.
Well, and female friendship is so important, right? And it's something I think as women that it is ingrained in us to nurture and have these friendships. How important was it to you? I mean, as you said, right? I mean, there's some female friendships can be messy, but they also can sustain a lot.
I think there's female friendship is incredibly powerful, is incredibly potent, and incredibly resilient. The things that we discuss as women, the things that we support one another through as women, there is something very special about that. And, male friendship is its own wonderful thing, but it is very, very different. We as women need other women to get through because by virtue of being women, we are marginalized. We do have a more difficult time, in life. And
Hmm.
so actually it was really heartening to write the novel and to realize these things as I was writing it. I don't think I necessarily went into the book thinking, this is a novel about friendship. You explore and you learn as you're writing. And that
Hmm.
that core thread of female friendship throughout was a really satisfying thing. And to get to the end of that novel and think, I hope I've done the experience of female friendship justice. And I hope I've made it a satisfying read for people. Yeah, it
So
was it was a great writing experience.
So before I let you go, I have to bring up the fact that your novel was chosen as a Good Morning America book club pick. What was it like to receive that news?
utterly bizarre. I really was not expecting it. I actually got the news quite early on. I think we'd only just sold the book to publishers.
Oh.
And I was sat on the sofa with my husband. I just put my toddler to sleep, and I'm based in the UK, so there's a time difference. And I got an email
Hmm.
from my editor, and she shared this, confidential news. And it was just utterly bizarre, me in my house in London, learning that it had been chosen for this huge book club, and I would be going out to America and going on telly, going on the TV. It was so amazing, yet so bizarre, sort of an out of body experience. And I thought, I can't scream and I can't wake up my daughter. I've only just put her down to bed. But yeah, going on that show on the sofa and meeting the presenters, they were so lovely, and it was just such a fun, colorful, happy experience being able to talk about this book that I'd sort of written in secret in my little garden office and not told anybody about. And then I was appearing on
Hmm.
US TV talking about it. It was surreal and incredible.
Well, I want to thank you so much for taking time to talk with us today. Really appreciate it. We've been speaking with Elizabeth Arnott about her newest novel, The Secret Lives of Murderers' Wives. It is out now. And that'll do it for this episode of Idaho Matters. Make sure you check out our podcast feed because you can find more episodes of topics that might be interesting to you. And for more local news and headlines, make sure you subscribe to the Connector podcast. And if you haven't yet, could I ask you to leave us a review wherever you listen? We read every single one, and we'd love to hear from you.
Every day on Up First, NPR's Golden Globe nominated morning news podcast, we bring you 3 essential stories. At the heart of each story are questions. What really happened? What really mattered? What happens next? At NPR, we stand for your right to be curious and to follow the facts. Follow Up First wherever you get your podcasts and start your day knowing what matters and why.